Welcome to Three Devs and a Maybe. Now introducing your show hosts, Michael Budd, Fraser Hart, Lewis Gaines, and Ed Mann.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Three Devs and a Maybe. My name's Ed Mann, and today we're very lucky to be joined by Matthieu Napoli. Hello, Matthieu.
Hi, hello.
Hello, and fellow my builder, Neal Brooks. How you doing, Neal?
Hello.
Hello. I should say there's been a couple of audio technical difficulties at the beginning of the show, but we're persevering. One of those reasons is actually because Neal was a late booking for the PHP Conference UK. So, Neal, how did that go yesterday?
Really well, actually. So the issue was that Rob Allen unfortunately had to drop out of his talk, which was all about running PHP on serverless architecture. And I had submitted a very, very similar talk. So the organizers asked me to drop in at the last moment and come and talk about Bref, actually, which was a fantastic thing to get out there to the UK audience.
Well, it's funny you should mention Bref because we just so happen to have the creator, Matthieu, on. So for the audience, we've spoken to Neal a little bit when he did his Symphony conference talk on Bref last year. And also I've spoken previously about kind of trying to run PHP in a service architecture. But it'd be really good to get your kind of history and really the definition of what really is Bref then.
Right. So Bref, it's an open source project, and the goal of the project is to basically help everyone to run PHP on Amazon Lambda. So the goal is to create serverless applications using PHP. And Bref is, it contains a bit of tools, a bit of a framework, but it's also, documentation. It's also a set of choices for third-party tools. And it's also a community. So Bref is all of that. And the idea is that when you use Bref, you got everything you need to create serverless PHP applications.
That's awesome. And really, I suppose we should ask then, why serverless? What is it about serverless then that drew you to it? And then obviously trying to, intertwine that with PHP.
Right. Well, when I started with serverless, I discovered that I was working on two projects, actually. One was a website. It's called returntrue.win. And one was a website. It was a software as a service. It's prettyci.com. And for both projects, what I was looking for is a way to run PHP code in a way that it's isolated and in a way that it's cheap. So I was looking at containers. I was looking at virtual machines, but it was really complex to set up. And it was, it could get expensive. So that's when I discovered Amazon Lambda. And it was maybe a year and a half ago. And that's what got me into it. And even though I was looking for something cheap, something scalable, and something, with isolation at the time, right now, that's not what serverless is to me and what's most important. What's really important right now, and I think what really need to focus on in serverless technologies is the simplicity. It's the fact that we can now write code and run it online without having to deal with the details of managing containers and servers. So that's really, really great.
Neal, you can chime in here, and especially when we're saying like cost is one big thing that you've shown that you've seen in your working. You're running loads of EC2 instances, massive infrastructure, and then being able to simplify that down into some very small serverless workflows.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually showed in a slide yesterday my own AWS billing console, and there's just a sharp decline in the amount of money that I've been spending personally since I got involved, started tinkering with Bref, so late summer last year, and I haven't had to pay for a single load balancer just to get those free SSL certificates anymore. So I'm getting that for free now, which is fantastic.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'd say we've spoken about FAS in the past, function as a service, the merits of serverless, one of them being there where you pay for what you use, and you can scale infinitely is really kind of like one of the big selling points of it. It'd be interesting, Matthieu, building Bref, what technical challenges did you actually come up against with the Lambda environment?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting topic because it changed a lot in the last few months. When I started
good
looking
old
into,
AWS.
yes. And, a year ago, there was no support for PHP on Amazon Lambda. And there are a few serverless providers that did and that do support PHP, but that's maybe not the majority. And on Amazon Lambda, the only way you could run PHP was through another language. So what we used to do, and that's what we did in the previous version of Bref, is that we would use like JavaScript lambdas and use JavaScript to actually run PHP. So that meant a lot of compiling PHP and dealing with all of that complexity. That wasn't really easy. And thankfully, it changed in November, because in November there was the Amazon reInvent conference. So that's where they announced a lot of new products and new services and new features. And they announced that there is no support for PHP on Amazon Lambda, but you can integrate any language you want via an open API. So that's what we looked into. And there still are some challenges to running PHP on Lambda, but it's much easier now. We still had to deal with compiling PHP and integrating the PHP execution model into the Lambda execution model. We had to deal with performance issues and also adapting frameworks to match several constraints of Amazon Lambda. But all in all, it's working. So that's great. That's really great.
I mean, the work you're doing is amazing. And I know that, Neal, the talk, and when we were talking about Bref and kind of the Lambda ecosystems, back in, I think it was October for Symphony conference, it is, as you say, with runtimes now, layering, all the AWS reInvent stuff that they churned out, it's completely changed. And one of the great things with Lambda is that, as you say there with compiling PHP, is that you can kind of just think of the environment. I mean, it's a containerized environment. You don't need to know that. It's just the abstraction levels. But you can compile, just like, as you say, you can compile PHP, compile these languages. And now providing like a runtime that allows you to have this nice, clean, open API to these things has really opened the door. And it must make your life, I suppose it must have made your life easier now. But obviously back in the past, like you wish you had this before. Performance-wise then, you mentioned, and kind of like that, how has that changed since going from 0.2 to 0.3?
We gained a lot in performances, and the main reason for that obviously is that we don't use JavaScript or any other language to execute PHP. So since there is no middleware between PHP and Amazon Lambda, obviously it's much faster. Now this is something we need to do more performance tests, and that's something that we need to do and to publish that on the Bref website. But still, we did some preliminary tests, and they are really good because we are getting closer and closer to what you could expect when running PHP on the classic EC2 instance. So that's getting interesting.
Yeah. So obviously, one of the big changes now that we have is moving from serverless to utilizing the serverless application model, or SAM. So do you think you could kind of tell us a little bit about what SAM is and why we had this big change of moving from serverless to SAM instead?
Yes. So in the previous version of Bref, we were using the Serverless Framework, and that took care of packaging the Lambda. Packaging the Lambda is basically taking up the code and creating a zip file and sending it to Amazon Lambda. And that was working really fine. But since the new version of Bref, the idea was to focus on a single provider, which is Amazon. And so we didn't need the serverless framework's feature to support many providers. So that was one of the reasons at least I started considering SAM seriously. And SAM provides as well some tools to run the applications locally. So you can run web applications locally with API gateway, with obviously Lambda locally, even DynamoDB as well, and it all runs using Docker. So you can run basically the same thing as in production on your machine without having to deal with configuring containers and trying to replicate the production environment. It's done for you. That's really a great selling point. And finally, SAM is great because it's Amazon's official tool to build serverless applications. So first, it's updated when there are new features. And it integrates with tools like Amazon's code deploy or code pipeline services. So that means that you can integrate your configuration and what you do with SAM with Amazon's services to deploy automatically whenever you push to GitHub or to whatever. So that's really interesting. And those were the main reasons why we moved away from serverless into SAM.
Is there anything you miss from the serverless framework that you kind of wish SAM had, or vice versa? You're kind of happy that, obviously, I mean, keeping up to date now, using the official, Amazon's kind of provided one is great. But is there anything, from serverless that you kind of wish you had?
It's not necessarily about the feature, at least for me. It's more about the community, because the serverless community is really big, and they are really, I don't know if they are passionate people, but anytime there's a new feature in AWS or anything, it's implemented really quickly. So we have to be a bit more patient with SAM. And I think that's maybe the thing we lost with the migration. But still, SAM is an official tool, so they keep it up to date. But it's maybe you have to wait 1 month instead of 1 week,
And it's all the things around it, isn't it? Like the infrastructure of deploying things, being able to like package up static assets, all the different kind of plugins, and that's the ecosystem that Serverless Framework gave you that now we're kind of going to have to reinvent in SAM or think a different way.
Right, yes, there's that. But I've used some plugin of the Serverless Framework, and while it's useful, it's always, you're not sure how much the plugin is maintained and how whether it's like the good way to deploy, for example, with the static assets. I was always, on the fence on whether that was the right way to do stuff. So plugins are great, but since they are really a community thing, I don't know. It's I was always not sure whether one was the right fit,
Another thing then, so with Lambda, so we've kind of touched on layers and the runtime and this new process that has been around since October. But it'd be really great maybe to go into the people who are either new to Lambda or kind of coming in from, I suppose, old Lambda now, the concept of layers and runtimes. So what actually then is a Lambda layer?
If you've done Docker, a great way to understand that is like a layer is like a Docker image. So that will provide you with some binaries, some libraries, and technically a layer is just a zip file. And whenever you say, I want to use the PHP layer, I want to use the whatever layer, it's basically saying include that zip file and unzip it whenever the Lambda boots. So whenever the Lambda boots, it will unzip the zip, and then you will end up with some binaries, some libraries. And that's what we do with Bref. We provide the PHP layers so that you have PHP installed on Lambda. Now, runtimes are a bit different. Runtimes are layers, but they also provide everything that's needed for the orchestration. That's basically they provide the script that runs whenever the Lambda boots. So that's with that specific script that we can do, for example, run PHP FPM or run the Symfony console or Laravel Artisan or whatever you want.
With the layers that Bref provides, I mean, how much does Bref give me if I need, say, maybe MySQL or Postgres or whatever? Like, is that support all built in for me? Can I just straight away drop in, replace what I'm already running on my server?
That's the idea. We try to provide most PHP extensions, like the most popular one. Because there are some size restrictions, we cannot, Bref cannot include all the extensions. But we try to provide the one that you are most likely to use. For example, MySQL and PostgreSQL. There's also an issue of what if you want an extension that Bref doesn't provide? And that's actually a hot topic right now. And I think the goal would be to try and make it as easy as possible to add support for custom extensions. That's something we need to work on. That's something that people have started to work on. So that's an interesting topic.
And like, as you say, like the fact that a layer is just a zip file, it unzipped into the opt directory in the Lambda container space, and that you can up to 5, so you can kind of overwrite. And I can see it was interesting looking at your implementation, how you've got, let's say, the PHP layer, but then you've got a layer console that overrides just the bootstrap of it. So you can kind of build up from these shared libraries and kind of compose kind of runtimes or these kind of like environments based on certain layers. And another thing there, so we've actually spoke about it off air, but it was something that I was really interested with looking at the source for the Docker builder pattern that you used and how you build these runtimes, because it's no easy task to build something like PHP. And as you say, for catering for many different kind of eventualities, Neal mentioned there MySQL and Postgres. You've got multiple different options of things. You've got your own extensions. So how has that kind of been developed over time? What made you kind of go along this approach of building up, say, like you've got the build Docker file, then you've got the PHP one, then you've got the actual export? How did that come about?
Yes, so that was for me the first time actually compiling PHP from source. That was for Bref. And so I had no experience with that. I managed to write some script that kind of worked. And hopefully someone named Buba came and contributed a really great build pipeline. So he used Docker containers and he wrote script that where you can say, okay, I want this PHP version and this PHP version and those extensions and those libraries, and it will build PHP and all the required libraries using Docker. So that was really clever. We iterated on that a few times to try to make it, as powerful as possible while try to keep it maintainable and simple, which is kind of opposite things.
That's the tricky one.
Exactly. But it works. It's really great. So that was a really huge work he did. And I was only responsible to try and, make it dumber because I was not able to maintain it and write it myself.
So is the idea then, envision that people say, like me and Neal can then say, oh, we want this new module, this extension in. We can then take this Docker, these Docker files, take this build process and actually create our own layers that we can use in our own private repos or private AWS accounts or, provide to the public.
Yeah, so that's an idea that we are actually discussing and trying to work on. But to be honest, I don't think it's ready. I mean, I think most of the work is here, but it's not documented. I think it's not really easy to use. And that's something that we need to work on, definitely.
And what layers then do you provide at the moment?
Okay, so we have 3 runtimes, 3 layers, same thing. One to write simple PHP functions. So when I say PHP functions, it's in the Lambda style. So you have an anonymous function that takes an event and returns a response. So that's interesting if you know about Amazon Lambda, if you've used Amazon Lambda in other languages, that's really interesting. If you've written web applications, then we provide the PHP FPM layer. So with that, that's really great because it's the same thing as usual. You have PHP FPM and you just say, here is my index.php, and then you can run Symfony or Laravel or whatever framework you want inside that index.php. So that's the layer I think most people will use. And then Bref provides as well, you mentioned it, the console layer, which builds on top of the PHP the base layer. And the console layer lets you run Symfony console or Laravel Artisan or any binary script actually on Lambda. And that's really helpful to run maintenance tasks or maybe crons with very easily.
And how does this differ then from 0.2? Because bringing in PHP FPM was one of those big things, especially in 0.3, to be like, aha. And I'm guessing that was catered based on the runtime environment that AWS provided.
Yeah, that was really exciting to be able to finally run PHP FPM there. Before that, we relied on PSR7. So you could run any framework that was compatible or that could be made compatible with PSR7. And that was, Zen Expressive.
You're running on a CLI SAPI, wasn't it?
Yes,
that was always yeah.
Exactly. So we wrapped and we abstracted, the HTTP request and HTTP response and connected that through PSR7 to the frameworks. But now with Bref 0.3, we don't need that anymore because we have PHP FPM, and that's really great. That means that we can run, any PHP application that works with PHP FPM. So that's a lot of it. Even though, of course, the application has to be compatible with the limitations of Amazon Lambda, and there are many of them. Like, for example, the fact that the file system is read-only, the fact that there's a maximum size for your code base, and other limitations I don't have in mind right now.
So as a PHP application developer, what would be the kind of workflow for building and testing and deploying my website using Bref?
Right. The good thing now that we have PHP FPM is that you can still, code locally and develop your application with your framework just as usual. So you can, test it locally with your web server. It could be the PHP's built-in server, or it could be Apache or Nginx, whatever you want. You can also as well use SAM's local Docker environment. So that's a possibility. However, it's a bit slower than the usual Docker setup, because they have the way they run the application locally is that they boot a new Lambda and a new container for every HTTP request. So right now it's really great to debug stuff locally, but it's not ideal, I would say, to do a full development cycle locally. And then to deploy, you would install Bref, you would install SAM, and you would basically follow the tutorial. What you would do is initialize Bref and then deploy with SAM with two commands. So those two commands, basically, they package the application and upload it to Amazon S3. So that's your whole code base uploaded to Amazon S3. And then the deploy process by SAM again would create everything you need in your application. For example, create the Lambdas, create the database, they create the API gateway that you would use, and any other resources that are linked to that. And SAM does the deployment using CloudFormation, so that's really great because with CloudFormation, everything is, it's an atomic deployment. Every resource is deployed at once, so that's really, really great to ensure deployments either succeed or fail completely.
Yeah, so you mentioned there you've got the console SAPI, the CLI SAPI, and now you've got the PHP FPM fast CGI SAPI. And there's another SAPI that I've been eagerly looking through actually, and it's the Loop SAPI that you've been working on. And I'm just wondering kind of, firstly, what is this and the kind of success and the merits of using this over a conventional approach?
Right. So this is completely experimental. So I guess for most people,
do not use in production.
Yes, exactly. And I think most people don't need to care about that, but that's still extremely fun to talk about this. This is basically a new way to run PHP. It's something that I hacked together, in the C code of PHP. That was the first time I looked into that code. And what I tried to do is copy the behavior of PHP FPM, but remove all the HTTP and fast CGI parts. So what you have a script, and the script will execute in a loop. And every time the script executes, the memory will be completely cleared. So the goal here is that you can run, for example, the Amazon Lambda script in a loop without having to start new processes for every invocation. And the idea here is only, to gain in performances, to gain in the call start and to gain on the start, the time needed for the process to start. So that's really interesting in performances because I think we get the best performances with PHP with this. Still, it's experimental and it's a completely new SAPI in PHP. So I'm not sure how it can be released, maybe as an extension, but I don't think, sending a pull request to PHP and waiting 3 years for it to be merged, maybe if they want it, I don't know what to do with that, honestly.
Definitely get it on Peckle and just leave it there for people who want to use it for sure. And plus, I mean, the fact is, the great thing about the abstractions of layers and runtimes is you can provide it and then people don't have to worry about that, which is a nice thing.
Absolutely.
And so how have you found success with this then? Have you been able to actually hack it together, get it working, get a proof of concept out there?
Yeah. So what I did is I did some performance tests. So I was able to compile it and use it in Amazon Lambda in a performance test. And we actually have a repository on GitHub that compares the performances of each runtime. So we have experimental runtimes, we have the runtimes that are actually provided by Bref. And on that repository, you can compare basically the overheads of each runtime. And usually it's between, depending on the runtime, it's between 2 milliseconds to sometimes even 50 milliseconds. That's interesting to see the differences between each.
So performance and package size is obviously a very, very big consideration for running Bref on Lambda. And in order to achieve that, Bref has to be opinionated in order to stay minimal. So what opportunities or challenges does that present to the users?
Yeah, that's really tough because the thing is that we are in a situation where there is not much to run PHP on Lambda, and even for serverless PHP, there is not much right now. And at the same time, I think that's what I think. I believe that in order to provide something actually useful, we have to make some choices. We have to provide something usable for the user, but that means not necessarily do every feature and cover everything. So for Bref, it's really a challenge to know what we should provide. For example, that's a really good example with the PHP extensions. We cannot provide all PHP extensions. First, because of the size and because of the performances, it bears on the Lambda, but also because of the maintenance effort. And so it's always a fine line between we should include that in Bref because most people will need it, or we should not include that in Bref because else the project will become unmaintainable and it will actually be worse, if we include that thing and that thing and that thing. That means also, for users, that you have something that, the goal with Bref and with all those choices is to have something that is easy to use and easy to understand. So that's great. We chose Amazon Lambda. We don't let you choose any other providers. Same, we choose Amazon SAM. You cannot use serverless and you cannot use other tools to deploy. So that's less choices for the user, which is great, but that also means that you cannot get out of these choices. If you want to, you cannot use Bref. So that's a set of limitations. And yeah, the idea is to hope that all those choices make it easier for the users.
Sure. So Lambda is kind of ubiquitous anyway. It's as far as I'm aware, it's kind of like the biggest name in cloud computing. So what you're ultimately doing with Bref, I guess, is supporting one thing and supporting it well, and that would be the goal.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it should be said then with layers and stuff, you mentioned there obviously the sizes of Lambdas and all these kind of, package size. Layers that you use contribute to that 250 megabyte max size. So anything that you add into any of your layers that you provide, for everyone to use is affecting them. So you've really got to be careful what you do because, as you say, the common base case, what do they really need? And is it just wasted megabytes that they're not, that's kind of impeding upon the business logic that they want to include?
Yes, and I think those constraints are actually useful for the project. They are not maybe useful for users, but it forces us to make choices. And I think for open source projects, and even for any kind of project, it's good to have to make some choices and to have some constraints. That way, it's also a way, to create an identity for the project. And I think, if there are other projects that come around and say, hey, we want to support PHP on serverless PHP applications, and they make different choices, that's really great. Because I don't think Bref should be everything. So having those constraints and having to make choices, it's good. It will create some alternatives, and it will create, I think, a sane ecosystem.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is actually really might show a lot of potential is the ability for users to take what Bref gives and then go ahead and extend it and create what they need to create and to customize things to their own kind of environments and their own needs. And I like the fact that the project just gives this easily replicable and predictable environment that people are going to be able to use and build upon.
Absolutely. And it would be really great, actually, to go a little bit back and kind of maybe do a little more of a deep dive into, we mentioned the Runtime API, the open API that AWS has provided. It'd be great maybe to go into that and kind of how that works under the hood, kind of demystifying some of this, because back in the day, I say that like it's probably 6 months ago, where, you'd use a Node.js app that then would just do an exec call to PHP CLI SAPI that pretended to be PSR7, pretended to be a web server. Then this has all changed, and you can now use the PHP FPM and everything like that. And you've got some great implementations we've used in sockets and been able to actually start that up and run that. How does the runtime work? What is the process?
So yes, the way the runtime works is that, in the layer, for a layer to become a runtime, it has to provide a file named Bootstrap. And the Bootstrap file is an executable that is basically the master process of the Lambda. And the Bootstrap file, when it executes, what it does is it will query an HTTP API, which is completely internal to the Lambda. It's what we call the Runtime API. So it's an HTTP API that has, I think, 3 or 4 endpoints. And the most important one is, an endpoint to get an event to process. So the bootstrap process will start, and we call the event endpoint to get an event to process. And that event can be, an HTTP request. It can be a message in a message queue. It can be anything. It can be any event that Lambda can process. So the bootstrap gets that event and then does whatever it wants. So with PHP, for example, with PHP FPM, the bootstrap file will get the event, turn the event into a fast CGI request. So basically an HTTP request. It will send that to PHP FPM, and PHP FPM will process, execute the PHP code and return a response. And the bootstrap process will convert that response back to Amazon's format. So basically the bootstrap file will replace Nginx or Apache in a classic PHP setup.
And the great thing is that you're using PHP actually for the implementation there, because it just has to be executable. So you can use PHP, which is great.
Yes, exactly. And that actually, it's really interesting because it's completely new at the same time and not new. It's basically the same thing as an HTTP proxy or HTTP server. But since we can do it in PHP, we can think of many crazy ideas and many crazy execution models. We can, for example, in the bootstrap process, run the PHP applications, just like, you can do with Swool or React PHP or PHP PM. You could have Symfony or Laravel running in the bootstrap process so that you can cut any, overhead communicating through the fast CGI protocol and have Symfony, boot once and just process requests in the same process. And that's actually really, really fast. The only downside to this is that you have to be careful about, memory usage and memory leaks. That's the same thing with React PHP and Swool.
I don't know whether you've looked into like the PHP RFC that's been approved for 7.4, which is the preloading. That seems like an interesting thing to be able to add into this.
Yes, I have not looked into that at all at the moment. I'm really interested to know if it can maybe improve the performances on Lambda. I don't know if anyone has looked at it. I know someone opened an issue on GitHub, but that's about it.
So what kind of immediate future features and additions do you think will be coming to Bref? And then kind of longer term as well, where would you like to see the project go, and how would you like to see things evolve?
I think in terms of features, there are many, many things we can add to Bref. And I have like 100 ideas, but I try to look from the actual problems of people trying to use Bref, and what's actually missing at the moment, I think, is mainly documentation. Like what we lack in if I can say, the PHP serverless ecosystem is experience and its resources. And just an example is, how do you use a database with Bref and with Amazon Lambda and with SAM? How can you use message queues? And I think that's the most important thing right now, is to document all of that. With time also as well, try to make Bref more open, as you mentioned, for the PHP extensions and all the build process, and simplify as much as we can. Especially, I think, the deployment part. I mean, using SAM is great and it works fine, but we still have to mess with the layer version numbers and mess with the regions. That's something quite painful at the moment. So I don't know how, but I would love to try and find some solutions to make that even simpler. And I guess also that we will receive, I expect that we will receive many contributions from people, trying to fix their problems and their use cases. So I'm sure that we'll get many things new that I can't even think of right now.
That was one thing that I was going to ask anyway, is so for users that maybe have got their own use cases and documentation requests and things. I mean, how can users get in touch and build a community around what Bref is achieving and see things developed that they would like to add into the project?
Right. I think that's one of the challenges we have right now. We have more and more contributors, and I think, Neal, you know that it's not always easy to communicate and also decide and agree together on what we add to Bref, what we leave out of it, and how we also add new features. And what's great is that we start slowly to find, some ways to work together. So we have obviously the GitHub repository. Now we have a Slack channel as well, which is really useful to bounce off some ideas from each other. And I think that's about it at the moment. I think we'll figure out along the way what should be in Bref and what shouldn't. One good way to keep everyone happy, I guess, is to have something that is open to extensions, like you said.
Sure. And so users can get involved with the community and the conversation on the Slack channel, which I believe is brefworkspace.slack.com.
Yes, we need to share the URL. I think the invite URL, it's not really visible right now. You have to dig into the issues to find it. But we need to push that to more people, I guess.
I'll definitely put that in the show notes as well.
Great.
Because, contributing to this is invaluable, especially, for, as you say, PHP is not natively supported by AWS. You mentioned actually in the beginning that some of the, that actually PHP is natively supported in other cloud providers. So I'm just wondering, do you envision maybe AWS in the future supporting a PHP similar to how it's like introduces support for Ruby? Or do you feel that maybe PHP will just be using this runtime open API?
Honestly, I have no idea. What I know for sure is that, when I started the Bref project, it was really about, the technical stuff, the code and the hack to run a PHP with JavaScript. And when Amazon announced that they published, the open runtime API, and then anybody could theoretically build their own runtime and run, let's say, PHP on Lambda, I was really happy, but at the same time, I was a bit sad because that means that maybe Bref didn't have a reason to exist anymore. And I think that's actually not the case at all. If there's better support for PHP on Lambda, that's really great. I think that Bref is more than just that. And that you mentioned the community, and that's a very big part of it. Writing serverless PHP applications is not just about, using a tool and using a framework. It's really more complex than that because we lack experiences, and we need to learn. We need to share together our experiences. We need to improve our tools. There's so much more than just the code. So I'm really not worried about the future of all of this. I think there's still a lot to do.
I think one of the things that Bref really gets right as well is the ease of accessibility for the documentation. It's that AWS documentation tends to be completely impenetrable. And I was speaking to people yesterday who completely agreed with that as well. They said, we just can't get into the documentation. It lacks tangible examples. So one of the things that I think that Bref is really, really doing well is coming up with examples and simplifying the documentation to make it much, much easier for people to get on board with.
No, I completely agree. And it'd be interesting, actually, maybe Bref in the real world. So how have you used this? Have you used this in any projects yourself? Have you seen this being used, maybe from 0.2 now to moving them over to 0.3, finding how much easier it is to use?
Yes, so that's, I guess for me, maybe Neal, you have some answer to that. For me, this is a tricky question because at the same time, I want to say that, anyone can use Bref and that's really great and go on and try it. That's great. But still, Bref is not suitable for, all scenarios. If you have a big, complex PHP application, and especially if it's legacy or whatever, maybe Bref is not really ready for that, for you yet. But, for small applications and, it's been now a year that I only deploy all my, small projects on Bref, and it just works. And that's really great. So for a very small application, it's perfect. It's really great. You don't pay a cent for that. I can't recommend it enough. Now for a mid-sized project, it depends. It depends how much, for example, database you are using, how you are uploading files, how specific your setup is. I know companies that do use Bref and that save, a lot of money thanks to that, and thanks to Amazon Lambda. So I guess it's up to how much you want to, struggle with some things, how much you want to get into those details. And I think over this year, it will be much more, usable in larger applications. At least that's the goal,
It's interesting because there still is that debate of whether you have one big Lambda that is like the catch-all, where you can bring in your typical web application, maybe built with Laravel Symfony, and let them do the framework routing and whatnot, or you use routing and take advantage of API Gateway and allow, maybe having these smaller functions that are very defined. What's your opinion on that? Do you kind of have a preferred approach?
Yeah, for me, I don't have an answer to that, honestly. I think that's a very interesting question. And I think we'll figure out the answer, over time, because we need more experience with all of this. Now we can look into, the same problem applied to microservices or even applied, to modular architectures. Do we really want to maintain 20 or 50 functions or just one or maybe 5? That can help answer the question.
And you have the tooling. The thing is with frameworks is you have that tooling already, don't you? It's the fact that you have like Laravel and Symfony that are doing all that work for you, do it well, and it's quite an easy task to just bring that into a serverless architecture, get the benefits of the pricing of the run what only using what you need and whatnot, and the scalability of that. And then maybe breaking things up.
Exactly. Yeah, I definitely start with something simple and then try to improve it. Just, make it work and then make it better.
Absolutely. And so finally for me, actually, I suppose more of a kind of looking into the future, really, what do you envision then, or what would you like from Lambda and serverless compute in the future? What can you see? I mean, no one knows what's going to happen next reInvent. I don't know whether you had any idea that this runtime open API was going to happen or this kind of thing. So what would you like to see? And then what do you reckon you will see?
For me, there's one technical thing that it is still a big problem with the serverless adoption. It's the cold start. That's we often hear about that, and it's really painful, when using a database on Amazon.
Would you mind maybe for the audience, if they haven't already listened to our previous episodes, like what is then the cold start that you're talking about?
Right. Amazon basically scales the containers, or they are not technically containers, but it's the same thing. They scale the containers on demand, depending on your traffic. But whenever a new container or a new Lambda instance boots, you will have an overhead which is called a cold start, and it can be between 200 milliseconds to maybe 500 milliseconds. So that can be really annoying if you are writing APIs where you want to have really good response times. And those cold starts can get even worse when using a database and using Amazon RDS. Because when using Amazon RDS, you have to put the Lambda into a VPC, whatever. Anyway, you can get like a 5-second cold start. So that can be a real big problem when writing a website or an API. And Amazon is working on that at the moment. They announced that in the beginning of 2019, they will solve that problem. I'm really eager to see that. And I really hope they can, fix cold start altogether and make them disappear. That will be like a really great, removal of a limitation.
Yeah, because at the moment you still have to do that keeping containers hot by cooling them and stuff. Essentially, you're hacking it, that you're just trying to say, no, keep me open. Like you assume that they last for, say, 15 minutes. So you're like, every 10 minutes, please just cool it and hope then that we'll keep at least a couple open.
Yes, exactly.
Or a couple alive.
Well, you can do that. And it works. It works fine for most applications. For some applications, it won't work because, what's important is, you have unpredictable traffic, so you can keep 1 or even 2 or 10 lambdas warm. But if you need at some point 50 lambdas to boot at one specific time, then you will still have those cold starts. So it's a workaround, but it's not perfect.
And have you looked into Firecracker at all? Did you that was another thing from reInvent, the kind of introduction of Firecracker, like being able to actually run your own lightweight virtualization. Like you mentioned there, that they're containers, but they're not containers. It's quite an amazing thing. Like I'll definitely put in the show notes some of the deep dives they go into, like how they do Lambda. But have you looked into Firecracker and seen how these things work under the hood?
No, I haven't. And they say you shouldn't really care about Firecracker and you shouldn't really use it. And so I listen to them, No, that's really interesting, to understand how they build
micro VMs and stuff.
Yeah, those micro VMs. Really, that's really great to learn about how they do that. Though I don't think anybody should, try to go and use it except maybe the cloud providers.
I wanted to ask you, actually, I know that you've recently started a serverless newsletter. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what kind of content and articles that you're putting together for the newsletter and how often people that sign up can expect to receive something from you?
Yes, so most people I talk with about serverless, they are really interested in the topic, but there is so much stuff going on, it's overwhelming. And the idea of the newsletter is to do a newsletter that is about serverless, but specifically about PHP-related stuff. So let's say, for example, there's a new database, a serverless database, that pops up in Amazon. Then it's interesting to you as a PHP developer. But if you try to follow Amazon's news, then good luck, So what I try to do is to compile everything that could be related and useful to PHP developers, and do a monthly newsletter to keep everyone up to date.
How do you find the time to do all this with Bref, along with other work? It's amazing.
That's a complex question. That's something I'm still working on. What I'm trying to do is to find a good balance between working with clients and keeping some days during the week to work on open source projects. So at the moment, I have usually 1 or 2 days a week to work on open source projects. So that's really great. That's much, much better than what I did last year, which was working late at night and working during the weekends. And that's something my personal goal is to try to find a good balance for the whole year, and try to make it a very stable thing. I did some open source projects in the past, and those were mostly, fun projects to learn and to try to make something that people use. It was really great and fun. Bref is a bit different. I really see a lot of potential, both on the open source projects and on the serverless technologies and on all of that. And I really want, I am actually investing a lot of time and a lot of energy in Bref. And that's something I will keep on doing for, this year and the next years as well. I just want to try to find something that lets me do that, the best way.
I think so. Just before we started the show, Ed and I were talking, and he said that he had been running through some of the GitHub history on the Bref project and saw the amount that you've been doing recently. Now, obviously, you're saying that obviously you're working a couple of days a week on Bref, but I know that you and I were up late debugging something last week because this this issue just kind of popped up that a couple of people said, well, hold on, all my routing's broken, and so I think it took us about 4 or 5 hours to debug and then figure out that there was a problem with a dependency. And so we then sort of made a fix to deal with that within Bref. So that's all stable again. I mean, are you getting enough sleep?
No, I am. I'm definitely am. This is actually a reason why I wanted to spend, some time during the week to work on the open source project. Is I want to have an actual good work-life balance and do something that is viable on the long term. So that's really all going great at the moment. Some nights, indeed, I can, work late, but it's okay.
Well, no, absolutely. And I'd say, the work you do is invaluable. And it's definitely, I mean, as you say, like it's helping not only get PHP on Lambda, but it's just the ecosystem and a serverless PHP ecosystem that will forever be needed because serverless is not going away. It's definitely the next compute, the next way of performing all of our tasks, all operations and stuff in a scalable manner. So it's invaluable to have that. And PHP, as I say, will not go away as well. So the two together work really well.
Yeah, they're a very good match, and both, on the technical side, because they share the same execution model and so forth. But I think that's even better, on the philosophical side. Serverless is about making things simpler. You have less to do, and it's simple, and you can just, push an application online. That's it. And I think with PHP, that's what it has always been about. It's really an accessible language, and it has gotten a bit more complex over the years. Both, PHP in itself, but, with deploying PHP applications, now you have to care about containers, you have to care about Ansible, Chef, Puppet, and orchestration and stuff like this. And going back to the roots of PHP, an accessible language where anyone can write some PHP code and just push it and it just works. It just runs in production, and it's on a production that's reliable, that's scalable. That's
it's quite amazing, isn't it? It's going full circle.
Exactly.
It's like going full circle. Absolutely. Well, so Matthieu, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you.
Neal, have you got anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so, really. I mean, there is one thing which is sticking in my mind, which is there are 1 or 2 different solutions to this problem emerging at the moment. So we've got solutions like image to Lambda, which I know is being worked on. So what makes Bref different to everything else, or maybe the best solution. I don't know if it's the best solution, but what sets Bref apart from the other emerging solutions that we have.
Right. So I wouldn't say like Bref is the best. I think it's a matter of what problem it solves. And some people will want, with EMG to Lambda or with other solutions, you have to, for example, deal with containers or build your runtime manually. And it's great. And some people will want to use that. And that's really fine. The idea with Bref is to address another need, which is I write some code and I want it to run online. That's basically it. And whether it runs with some runtimes on whatever or something else, that's mostly a problem for us Bref maintainers. So again, I think that's okay if there are many solutions on using the same technologies, because the approach and the people, the users that it targets is what's most important.
Absolutely. I say thank you so much. And Neal as well, thank you for taking the time. I know that you're at PHP conference at the moment, so you're trying to find some time, nice quiet area and stuff.
Yeah. It's been a good chat.
Awesome. All right then, audience. Well, thanks again for listening to us, and we'll be back next time. Speak to you soon.
You've been listening to 3 Devs and a Maybe. You can contact us at contact@3devsandamaybe.com or follow us on Twitter at 3 Devs and a Maybe.